Good morning.
Hi,
Good
all.
morning.
If you want to make Steve and I co-host, please feel free.
Great. Done. Okay. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning.
I want to say things like, I hope everyone's doing well today, but who knows how everyone's doing. I hope everyone is doing human today.
It's going to be very, very warm in Portland. So everybody's like, okay, it's going to be, it's supposed to get to 96 today, which is very,
Wow.
or has been
Yeah.
unusual to the last couple of years. So
Okay. Okay. So I take it people are probably staying indoors on a day that's that hot.
it won't get to that temperature until towards the end of the day. So I think some of us will be outside in the shade.
Okay.
We've already
Um,
been out for a walk.
Yep. We were to the farmer's market this morning. So
nice. In the early morning hours before it gets too hot. Well, it's still
yeah.
nice to go outside.
Yep.
Indeed. Okay, great. Well, I imagine a few more people may join us in the coming minutes, but I want to respect the time of everyone who arrived now. So I'm gonna start with a blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I am going to put the materials in the chat. Laura should have emailed these to at least the folks who are on the Torah study email list. But for anyone who doesn't have it handy, or for anyone who's not on that list, it is uploading into the chat now. Yep, there it is. Okay, so you should all have access to that. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and share my screen in just a moment. We are today in the third installment already. So we are about to be halfway through with our series on the women you won't meet in Hebrew school. And as promised, for those of you who were with us for Torah study yesterday, today, not chosen because of current events, just chosen because this is, I think, an important woman to meet. But we are going to be taking a look at a woman whose bodily autonomy is not her own. And so it does, in its own unique way, intersect with current events, and maybe will give us a different lens to think about what is happening now. As we always say, Torah has something to teach every generation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we are going to jump into Torah study today with Bat Yiftach, known in English as Jephthah's daughter. So can I ask for a volunteer to raise your electronic hand if anyone is willing to read for us the actual story of Bat Yiftach from Judges?
Steve was going to read.
Thank you, Steve. You're muted, Steve.
I am happy to read if no one else wants to. I want other people to get a chance because I do too much, but I will start. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was an able warrior who was the son of a prostitute. Jephthah's father was Gilead, but Gilead also had sons by his wife, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out. They said to him, "You shall have no share in our father's property, for you are the son of an outsider." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the Tob country. Men of low character gathered about Jephthah and went out raiding with him. Sometime later, the Ammonites went to war against Israel. And when the Ammonites attacked Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah back. They said to Jephthah, "Come, be our chief, so that we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah accepted, and Jephthah made the following vow to Adonai: "If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me on safe return from the Ammonites shall be Adonai's and shall be offered to me as a burnt offering." Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites and attacked them, and Adonai delivered them into his hands. When Jephthah arrived home in Mitzpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrel and dance. She was an only child. He had no other son or daughter. On seeing her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, daughter, you have brought me low. You have become my troubler, for I have uttered a vow to Adonai, and I cannot retract." "Father," she said, "you have uttered a vow to Adonai. Do to me as you have vowed, seeing that Adonai has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites." She further said to her father, "Let this be done for me. Let me be for 2 months, and I will go with my companions and lament upon the hills, and there bewail my maidenhood." "Go," he replied. "Let her go for 2 months." And she and her companions went and bewailed her maidenhood upon the hills. After 2 months' time, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She had never known a man, so it became a custom in Israel for the maidens of Israel to go every year for 4 days in the year and chant dirges for the daughters of Jephthah the Gileadite.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, I'm gonna stop my share for a minute. Anyone who wants to look back over the story has a copy of it. And if anyone arrived after I shared it in the chat and needs it, please just let me know. But before we dive into secondary sources and ways to read this story and modern midrash, etc., just curious what your initial reactions are, questions that come up for you, things that aren't clear, things that bother you about this story. Yeah, just your insights from reading the story itself before we let the sources plant ideas in our head.
I'm just curious why Jephthah would think that God would think that this was a good idea. It smacks of idolatry to me that you would think something like that. And what did he think was going to come out his door? A chicken? I mean, seriously, what was he thinking?
Yes. What did he think was going to come out of his door? I think is like the $1 million question in this story.
And there's also, isn't there a Greek or Trojan story that's very similar to this about the father coming home from the war and he greets the daughter runs out, and it's the same story.
That I did not know. If anyone knows the name of that story, I would like to read it.
I don't know, but they got it from us if there is one.
Julie, you look like you want to voice your disapproval.
Yeah, because it's human sacrifice, and I just it just seems so wrong. I mean, maybe there's more of it in the Bible that I haven't noticed, but somebody sacrificing their daughter, holy cow.
Great. So I think in taking Julie's comment and Judith's comment right off the bat, what other story that we have is this story reminiscent of, and what are the key differences between those two stories?
Well, the Akedah is the other story where there's a burnt offering being offered of a human, and God says, "Come on, I was kidding. I was just testing you." And in this case, there's no. The difference here is, at least what I read, there's nobody saying, "Dude, you really don't have to burn your daughter." And so I think that's huge. I don't know whether that's because she's not a patriarch and doesn't have the same value, or whether she's a woman and doesn't have the same value. But you would think that Adonai would stop this.
And Adonai's not even there. I mean, he's barely in the story.
Right. God is vowed to, and Jephthah feels that he has to carry this out because he has made this vow to God. But we don't have Jephthah as a prophet. We don't have Jephthah hearing God say, you better fulfill that vow, right? And at the same time, as Steve points out, we also have the absence of intervention by God, right? In the Akedah, we have God overtly appearing in the story to intervene. And there is an absence of that in this story. And it does raise questions, as Julie pointed out, about the larger question, the larger idea of child sacrifice in the Bible, in this region at this time, and sort of what unanswered questions we have about that as a practice. It certainly doesn't sit well with us as modern readers. And it also probably didn't sit that well with the authors and redactors of the Bible by the time we get to the final version of it, because if it was a practice, we actually see that practice sort of being condemned and written out generally. And so the fact that this survives is also interesting. Okay, so moving away from the child sacrifice aspect of it, and we don't know how old Jephthah's daughter is. We don't actually know if she's a child or a young woman, a maiden. We don't know her age. What other elements of the story are there that are interesting to us or that give rise to questions beyond the huge problem of the father, sacrificing his daughter? What else is interesting to us about the story? Yeah, Sherry.
Actually, it was Steve that wanted to say something. Steve, you had
Yeah.
something you wanted to ask.
Yeah, in the middle of this, I had a coffee spill. Yeah, we were saying, what was God thinking? Aren't we giving human characteristics to God? How do we know God thinks?
Okay, great. Just some small questions from Sherry and Steve. Yeah, okay. So
That's just,
your question is actually not about the text itself, though, but about the questions that we're asking about the text.
yeah.
Great.
We're attributing human characteristics to God.
I'm
willing to
currently
accept-
attributing human characteristics to a tree because I'm watching a tree and you're talking, Steve, and it's like the tree is talking to us.
You tell him, Savant.
Well, and I think we're willing to say that, we shouldn't be anthropomorphizing God. And so when we say God's got hands or lips or feet, we're God's hands, lips, and feet. But I'm very, very willing to accede to God that God thinks and has opinions and expresses those opinions in a way that people can hear them, perhaps not through a mouth. But I God certainly has agency. I hate that phrase, but I will use it.
Yeah, and we see God. I don't know if we see God thinking, but we certainly see God speaking in a way that makes it seem as if God thinks throughout the Bible. I just started reading the guide for the Perplexed today, and Maimonides is talking about B'Tselem Elohim and what does it mean for us to be created in the image of God. And this idea that actually it's not at all anthropomorphic. It's not that we look like God or are in the physical form of God. It's that God has reason and that we have reason, and that is actually what it means. Only in Maimonides' perception, but that's another line of thinking about what it means for us to be created B'Tselem Elohim, is to have the ability for rational thought. Phyllis and Warren, did you have your hand raised? And then Diane and then Steve?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that no one but Jephthah was able to come and be the chieftain to carry out this war. And maybe it was because he knew the Ammonite people, but it seems kind of strange that they would have to go and get him to do that.
Especially after they kicked him out, right?
Right.
Yes. So there's some strange, contentious familial relations happening in this in this story. Yeah, Diane and then Steve and then Steve.
Well, that's what I was wondering, is they kicked him out. And then he's like, sure, I'll come help you and I'll sacrifice whatever comes out of my door. So it's like he's jumping head over heels to try and please the people that kicked him out.
Right.
And
So there's a reading of him really wanting the approval of the people of his tribe, right? Feeling rejected by them and then wanting to prove himself to them when they come asking for his military skills. Yeah. Steve Holmes and then Steve Philo.
Jephthah says nothing in this.
Steve, I can't
Helen,
hear you.
she's
I
completely
hear you,
silent.
but I can't hear you.
She's
Oh, you're muted again now,
Yeah,
Steve.
now you're
Unmute.
muted.
There we go. And you're muted. Nope, you're still muted.
she's
Oh, now
completely
you're good.
she's completely silent in this. She's completely passive. So it's like the whole story includes her, but she says nothing.
That's interesting. I'm going to push back on that. We have a lot of cases of biblical women who are acted upon and say nothing, but this is actually not such a case. What does she actually say? How does she intervene? And what is her stance on her father's vow, if anyone remembers from the reading of the story?
She wanted to follow what her father had decided.
Yeah, she actually speaks up in this story, which we don't always see. Compare this to a story like Dinah, the sister of the 12 tribes, who is acted upon without having anything to say in her story. In this case, she actually says, Father, she said, you have uttered a vow to the Lord. Do to me as you have vowed, seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites. She further said to her father, let this be done for me. Let me be for 2 months, and I will go with my companions and lament upon the hills and there bewail my maidenhood. So she both affirms her father's choice to vow what he has vowed, even at the cost of her life. She says, you've made this vow, go ahead and do the thing you have to do. And then she negotiates. She negotiates with her father. And by doing so, she actually negotiates with God. She says, first, give me 2 months to go and be with my girlfriends in the hills. What is the exact phrase? Bewailing my maidenhood. So I'm curious what you all think is going on there. How do you read this request that Jephthah's daughter makes? Sort of a prisoner who's sentenced to death asks for a last meal. This is kind of her last request, right? What do you make of this?
Well, so first, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, when I first read it, bewail her maidenhood, I'm thinking, so she's bewailing that she's never going to have sex with a man. And that seemed like that's what clicked in my brain. And then when we read it again today, I'm like, yeah, that's what her maidenhood's all about. Because a maiden is a woman who has never had a child. The way what maiden is never, yes.
Well, and
Steve?
so you commented earlier that we don't know how old she is, whether she was old or young or whatever, but we do kind of know how old she is, because we know that if she was like a 4-year-old, she wouldn't be worrying about her maidenhood or going off into the hills with her friends. So we know that, and we know she's virgin. So I mean, we can kind of guess approximately her age range. And the whole thing about going off for 2 months seems, I don't know, it just seems weird to me, because it's sort of like, of all the things you could ask for, it's like, oh yeah, you can kill me and burn me up, but give me a couple months with my BFFs first. It doesn't make sense to me that she would ask for, I would think maybe she'd want to get rid of that maidenhood. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't really jive with me, right? It doesn't make sense. I'm having trouble figuring out why that would be the request she would make.
Okay, interesting.
Why 2 months, not 6 months?
Why not more time? Okay, yes, interesting. Warren and Phyllis?
So is the word bewail, are there other ways to look at the Hebrew? And could it be more of a not negative thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If it could be read more as like commemorate or celebrate, mark. Yeah. Yes, that's an interesting question. Okay, so I think based on the last few comments, a little light could be shed for us on this by turning to one of the modern commentators. This is going to be the first time I'm going to bring something from this book to you, I believe. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is from a book called The Harlot by the Side of the Road from Jonathan Kirsch. I cannot recommend this book enough. If you leave our time of study together and only buy 2 books, one of them should be the Listen to Her Voice by Mickey Raver, which I'm often bringing for both biblical translation and for secondary source material. And the other should be this book, The Harlot by the Side of the Road. This is an incredible collection. And what he brings to us in terms of collecting the extant Jewish midrash and rabbinic lens on a story, and then pairs that with comparative literature and comparative religion and what was happening in the rest of the world at that time is remarkable. So we are going to see if we can gain a little bit of insight into the story of Bat Yiftach through the lens of Jonathan Kirsch's The Harlot by the Side of the Road.
Can I ask a quick question? Right, the very first sentence here says, "What exactly are Jephthah and her companions doing?"
Yeah, that should be the Jephthah's daughter.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. It's probably a typo in the ebook version. I have both the hard copy of the book and the ebook, and I often find that there are typos in the ebook that there aren't for all of my books. Actually, something happens unfortunately when people translate things into electronic books. Okay, can I ask for a volunteer who would be willing to read for us from The Harlot by the Side of the Road?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Everybody should. Oh, wait. Well, Phyllis and Warren have
Yeah,
volunteered.
Phyllis and Warren, please.
Okay, I'll be happy to read. What exactly are Jephthah and her companions doing during those 2 months at large in the mountains of Canaan? The Bible tells us nothing more than what we read in Judges. Jephthah's daughter, quote, bewails her virginity, unquote, with her companions, and they commemorate her every year thereafter. But no such ritual is mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. Still, even the spare and oblique words of the biblical text are enough to provoke the imagination. And somewhere beneath the imperfectly sanitized tale told by the priests and scribes, we can make out dimly something strange and tantalizing, a forbidden tradition that somehow escaped the censor's pen. At least one excitable exegete speculates that Jephthah's daughter and her companions are acolytes of a sex cult in which Israelite women are dedicated to the deity, presumably Baal, by an act of ritual defloration. Another proposes that they belong to a pagan fertility cult based on the ancient and primitive custom of annually bewailing the dead or ousted spirit of fertility during the dry or winter season. No less an authority than Northrop Frye allows that Jephthah's daughter herself became the center of a local female cult, doubtless originally on the principle that virgin goddesses like Artemis are often the protectors of childbirth. A great many scholarly readers of the Bible discern that Jephthah's daughter, the features of other figures from Greek myth, Persephone, lost my place. Okay. Who is abducted by the king of the underworld to become his wife, but is permitted to return to the surface of the earth to visit her mother, the goddess Ceres, at seasonal intervals, or Iphigenia, a virgin who is selected for sacrifice to Diana, but is spared so that she can spend her life in service to the goddess. But all of them agree that some faint trace of a forbidden and forgotten ritual is preserved in the biblical account of Jephthah's daughter.
Thank
may
you. I'm going to stop you there just because this excerpt is kind of long and I want to spare any one person from having to read too much of it. And we can just pause for a moment to see what is happening here. So we have a lot of different hypotheses from throughout history about what's going on in the story of Jephthah's daughter. And specifically, they're trying to answer this question that we ourselves were trying to ask of why is it that she asked to spend the last couple of months of her life in the mountains with her girlfriends, and what are they doing out there? And Steve, I think, said, wouldn't she maybe want to, have gotten rid of that maidenhood? And here we have someone who speculates that maybe it was an act of ritual defloration. We have quite a few scholars who can't really imagine that anything could have been going on with these women outside of the idea that they were in some sort of a sex cult or in some sort of a fertility cult. And then we have a little bit of comparative religion to sort of tell us why people might be thinking that. We have people who are polytheists who are going to be going out into the mountains to have spring rituals and fertility rituals, etc. We have some parallels in the story itself with Persephone, the myth of Persephone and Demeter, or Ceres is the Roman name. And we have Iphigenia. We have some sort of other characters from literary history of the time that this story kind of looks like. We have the idea that this was a pagan cult, the sort of Jewish equivalent of what would have been going on in Greek society at the time. Did we get to that? I don't remember if we got to that. Diane. Diane, you're muted.
I was also thinking about his mother was a prostitute. And can that sometimes mean instead that it's actually in service to like another deity type of situation?
So yes and no. Yes, that is sort of the common understanding that many of us have inherited, is that the women who served in the temples of foreign gods and goddesses were a kind of cultic prostitute. But no, actually modern scholarship shows that that practice probably either never happened at all, or if it happened, only happened once a year between the high priestess and the high priest, and that it was almost certainly not the actual practice of the time. But an interesting parallel, right? Like many times in our work together, we're looking at the intersection of harlotry or prostitution and idolatry in the Bible, and so here is another way that we're sort of looking at that, like, oh, is what she was doing, like, here's the granddaughter of a prostitute, and is what she was doing actually going out and doing some sort of pagan ritual in the mountains? Great. We did not read this paragraph. Okay, this is where I stopped you. Okay. Can I ask for another volunteer who's willing to read a few paragraphs of this for us?
I'll read it.
Yeah, please.
It may well be that there was a local pagan cult of a Persephone-like goddess whose origins had been forgotten, and the story of Jephthah's daughter was invented to account for the existence of the cult, as well as to justify its existence, speculates one contemporary Bible critic. Another scholar entertains an even more startling scenario. Judges may be the literature of a feminist intelligentsia in ancient Egypt, a collection of stories that gave them the courage to live marginally in a fashion resembling witches in New England. The Bible offers at least one intriguing clue to the mystery of what Jephthah's daughter and her companions are actually doing when they take to the hills to bewail her virginity, although the real meaning of the biblical text is concealed and distorted by a common mistranslation of a single crucial word. The word Betulem, that is usually translated in English as virginity, does not refer to virginity at all, but rather to the stage of a young woman's life when she is capable of having children, perhaps signaled by the onset of puberty and a young woman's menarche or first menstruation. In other words, Jephthah's daughter is not bemoaning the fact that she will die without engaging in sexual intercourse with a man, Rather, she is sorrowing over the fact that she will be cut off from her people before she has become a mother in Israel, before she has progeny, her posterity.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, there's a little bit more, but we can talk about this first. So I think that this sheds a lot of light on the story of Jephthah's daughter, this idea of mistranslation. And I think because we in America are so often reading the Tanakh in translation, it's really important for us to do close readings like this, where we understand about word choice when something is translated. So we actually read the JPS translation translates this as bemoaning her maidenhood, right? I actually think that's closer to what the word is meant to be. Maidenhood as opposed to maidenhead can refer to a period of time in a young woman's life. And that seems to be closer to the actual biblical intention of this word. But in most translations that you will come across of the story of Bat Yiftach, what you will see is that they were bewailing her virginity. And so then it comes closer to the questions that we were asking about, why does she want to go out for their girlfriends into the hills? And, is she so upset that she's going to die a virgin? And this, I think, gives a richer reading for us, that it's probably the fact that she was going to die at that stage in her life that is problematic for her. And remember that we are at a period in history where the most important thing that a woman can do is be a mother in Israel, right? We read Deborah and Yael last week, I'm pretty sure. No, we read Jezebel last week. 2 weeks ago, we read Deborah and Yael. And when there's the celebratory poem about what happens, it says, arose Deborah, a mother in Israel. She wasn't even known as a mother in her story. And yet in her moment of glory, the big compliment that is laid on her poetically is that she arose a mother in Israel. So this is like the greatest thing that a woman can become, is a mother in Israel. And so here, Jephthah's daughter is probably bewailing the fact that she will never become a mother in Israel, that she is going to die before she ever has that opportunity. And that's, I think, a richer and more complicated reading than the idea that she's bewailing the loss of her virginity, or that she's going to die a virgin. It's more complicated than that. And just the idea of dying at that life stage when your entire life is literally ahead of you is what she's looking at. Okay, can I ask for another volunteer to read for us the next couple of paragraphs of this? Yeah, Diane, please.
Okay. Perhaps the rituals performed by Jephthah's daughter and her companions on a remote hilltop can be regarded as nothing more startling than a rite of passage in a celebration of puberty that was generally observed by the women of ancient Israel. Only because Jephthah's daughter is forced to celebrate her coming of age under the threat of death does the observance described in the Bible seem so ominous. Only because Jephthah's daughter goes to her death does the same observance later become a yearly ritual of remembrance. That is why some Bible critics reject any suggestion that Jephthah's daughter was the priestess of a pagan sex cult and urge us to regard the rites and rituals of Selah and her companions as something wholesome and essentially secular. A counter movement of resolution and repair serves to emulate her tragedy, as one contemporary Bible critic puts it.
Okay, I'm going to pause you for 1 second. So first of all, Selah is the name that a later midrash is going to give to her. So Jephthah's daughter is unnamed in the Bible. A later midrash is going to call her Selah. So that's why Jonathan Kirsch is referring to her as that here. But what he's saying here is maybe this is like her bat mitzvah, right? Maybe she's saying, actually, before I die, can I possibly go into the hills and celebrate the fact that I am at this stage of life of becoming a woman? Like, can I at least have that ritual that I would have had anyway before I'm going to be killed, right? So we can think of this, maybe, just maybe, I'm just going to throw it out there. Maybe a more likely explanation for what happens than pagan sex cult is that she was going out to celebrate, her coming of age. And that's why she specifically wanted to do it with her girlfriends, right? which I appreciate as a maybe a more realistic, sometimes it's wild to me what the scholars come up with when they're trying to understand particularly the choices of the women in the Bible, and how quickly they go to sex cult and polytheism. I find polytheism in the Bible very interesting, but I don't know that it's always the first place that we need to go for all of our biblical characters. Yeah, so maybe instead of her being the priestess of a pagan sex cult, she was actually going to celebrate her puberty before she was going to end her life abruptly. Okay.
And thinking about that, because I keep thinking about that I know the Celts and probably other ancient peoples had a whole ritual when a woman had her first menstruation for her to go into the woods and sit on the ground and leak it into the ground as a way to connect herself to Mother Earth and to spread, give her fertility to Mother Earth. It was, and I know it's definitely with the Celts, but I'm very sure it's in other cultures. I think it's some in American indigenous cultures too. So that could have been something women did back then, and they just didn't tell, the guys about what they were doing there. Not their business.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone here is a fan of The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, there's an entire puberty ritual that Dina goes through with her mothers when she gets her period. If it was the practice of women in the Tanakh that when a young woman got her first period, there was some sort of an earth-based ritual, some sort of a ritual that the women undertook to commemorate that first period, why wouldn't we know about that? Why wouldn't that be in the Tanakh itself?
Because the Tanakh was written by men and they didn't tell them.
Yeah, so
or they felt embarrassed, or the men felt embarrassed to be discussing such intimate matters.
I love that answer, because one of my favorite stories in all of Tanakh is when Rachel steals her father's household gods. She steals her father's idols. And when her father comes looking for them, she has hidden them under her skirts. And he says, stand up, I want to search you. And she says, I'm sorry, you can't touch me now. I'm on my period. And he basically runs away immediately. And I just always read that as the biblical equivalent of for thousands of years, men have been too afraid of women's periods. All you have to do is say, I'm on my period, and they're like, I'm out of here. So yes, it could have been embarrassment. We literally have a biblical story to back that hypothesis up. But I think that your first point, Judith, may be the greater explanation, which is that, and we know this from modern history, right? So we have we don't have everything that was written from the biblical age, right? Too much of it has been lost to us. But in much more recent history, we see the difference between histories of men versus histories of women. And histories of women, first of all, books about histories of women almost, historically before the last 100 years, almost don't exist. What we do have is from letters and scraps of things, or women's diaries, right? But we have a lot of what we call material culture, right? People's relationships to things in their daily life and practices. We have almost no information about that for women for most of written history, because history has generally historically been written by men. And the daily lives of women, the things that they do in their homes, in their kitchens, rituals around their period, their fertility, etc., have largely been absent from the written history that we've inherited. Fun fact, the world's first calendar, or what's believed to be the world's first calendar, is a stone with 28 lines etched onto it. And people say, oh, here is mankind's first calendar. And people say, no, actually, here is womankind's first calendar, because if it's 28 days that are being marked off on this thing, that is a woman's fertility cycle, right? So probably the first calendar that we have is actually, but we have only scraps of that. We don't have bodies of work about history in modern history. And so we can apply that to ancient history as well. We very well could have had a regular practice of women celebrating their first periods in the biblical era that never got written down, because it was considered women's history and not considered something that was worthy of writing down or necessary to write down. Okay, someone had their hand up while I was talking at length. No? No. Okay, great.
I was just wondering about lost books, and you were kind of mentioning that. And I was, what kind of books may have been lost for, like from Miriam, and what we don't have. Especially since Miriam was also a prophet. What are we missing from there?
Right. Yeah. And there's a really interesting article written about women prophets in particular, and how the way that their prophecy manifests is different, including music being one of the ways that they express their prophecy. And so it may have been that men's practices in history started to be put into writing, while women's practices were manifesting in different ways that may not have been written down. It may not have been important to write down. I'm thinking about the Christian tradition, where there's all these accepted gospels, and then there's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is not an accepted gospel, right? The one gospel that is written ostensibly by or about a woman is the one that is not incorporated into the canon. So yeah, we have a lot of that, even when we have women's books, or look at the Book of Judith, which, if we're together for Hanukkah this year, I'll bring to everyone. The Book of Judith was not canonized by us. If the Christians hadn't kept it for us, we would have lost the Book of Judith. So there's an example of a book we know existed, was a scroll about a woman. We, the men who chose to, what went into the Bible and what didn't, what was canonized, chose not to canonize that book. And it would have literally become a lost book if other traditions hadn't kept it and we hadn't found it again thousands of years later. Okay, I'm gonna get off of that soapbox. Diane, can I ask you to continue reading this next paragraph for us?
Figure out where I'm at.
Right here.
Okay. But there is another way to understand and appreciate the secret observances of Jephthah's daughter and her companions in their wilderness sanctuary. We do not need to dress her up in an alluring costume of a sex cultist, but neither do we have to strip away the rich trappings that are suggested even by the spare lines of text in the Bible. Rather, we can begin to see Jephthah's daughter as someone who recognizes, responds to, and satisfies a deep and undeniable longing among the people of ancient Israel that is left unfulfilled by a male deity.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I think that's the end of that excerpt. Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to stop my screen share just for a minute before we transition from this into some modern midrash in the form of poetry. And now that we've read all of this and thought about a few different lenses that we can put on what happens for Jephthah's daughter, I want to ask, from your own personal experiences, if you were in her shoes, why might this be what you asked for? Can you put yourself in her shoes in a way that makes it make sense what she was doing with her girlfriends and why? This is more about your experience and less about there being like an answer to the question I'm asking.
I can imagine going off with my girlfriends. I don't imagine coming back. I don't imagine coming back. Oh no, sorry, no.
That's what I was going to wonder.
We're just going to keep going.
Do we have to choose that, or can we choose to rebel?
Right.
Diane and I are
Yes.
running off together right now.
I'm with Judith.
And Julie's with us too.
Find a good spot.
Judith, Julie, and Diane are actually going to go off and start the Israelite equivalent of the Amazons, right? Yes. Great. Okay. So let's put aside the coming back part, right? Because the coming back is she's being a good daughter. She's helping her father fulfill his vow to God. She's showing that she's devout, that remember, we're still in a book whose mission and purpose is to teach us about how to worship the one God, right? That is the agenda of the Bible. So she's doing the right thing. And by the way, in the story of the Akedah, there's a midrash about Isaac that says that he too said that he knew what was happening. And he said, yes, absolutely, sacrifice me. You have my permission to do so. So there's, in this worldview at this point in history, there is a thought that even the child who's being sacrificed should be willing to do so for the sake of worshiping God. Okay, so let's just put that portion, that aspect of the story aside for a moment. Forget about the coming back part. But as we can think about yeah, like it makes sense for us to go off with our girlfriends. Just say more about that. Why is that something that you can get behind?
They'd understand. I mean, that their heads would be look what just happened. Their heads would be in the same space in terms of their reaction. They would be the one people you could be venting to about how absurd this is. Or how dutiful a daughter you have to be, though I don't see that being my reaction.
Okay, yes, Steve.
So I was thinking, I wonder why, so there's got to be something really significant about a 2-month period, which,
It's not a biblical number.
it's not a biblical, it's not like a Jewish number particularly. It's not the 28 days, that we think about. We're like, oh, I want to go away for 26 days, and here's why, and I was thinking, well, like, why would she not ask, okay, Dad, you can do what you want with me. How about if you wait till after I've had my first child or something, so that she could fulfill that, if she really thinks she's being sacrificed because it's a good thing, and being a mother in Israel is a good thing. It seems like a bad job of negotiating. I say that, flippantly, but still, that bothers me too. So I wonder, so I can't answer your question because I don't see myself ever saying, I don't see anybody ever saying yes to that. But but what bothers me most, I think, is that I don't understand the 2-month duration.
I don't
And
I don't understand that either, but I'm thinking maybe she was going with her girlfriends to kind of come to terms with it. And the fact that this sacrifice is not just being made, she's really sacrificing her life for peace of the community, because it would stop the war that was going on. So it's not like she's just being sacrificed because she drew the short lot. It's because, or she did draw the short lot, but it's, coming to peace with my family and my community saved.
Yeah. That reading, Pat, is very kind to Jephthah. It's not that you're wrong, but it's interesting to me that we're actually questioning the choices and the motives of Bat Yiftach in this story at all, when she doesn't really get to choose. A woman in ancient Israel belonged to her father and then belonged to her husband. That was her status in society. That was her legal status. This is a woman whose choices about her body and her life are being made for her by her father. Okay, Janet, you have your hand up, and then Phyllis and Warren, and then Sherry and Steve.
I was thinking that when we first read it, that she wanted to go to make sure she wasn't pregnant, because then she would have an argument against having to do it. And the 2 months would, depending on when her cycle, whatever, would clearly clear that up in her mind.
Interesting. So then it becomes sort of reminiscent of the Bathsheba and David narrative, right? Where we had to know that her period came at the beginning of the story for everything to be clear, right? And so questions about people's lives and situations are determined by their status as pregnant or not pregnant. So it's a completely different lens than the idea of the fact that this is men making decisions over women's bodies. And yet at the same time, it's another way that it comes back to how can this story intersect with what we're grappling with in our own culture today. Warren and Phyllis, and then Sherry and Steve.
So I'm going with the idea that this was an important thing for a young woman to do. And this was one thing she was asking that she could do before she died. So it was really important to her. And she had thought about it and obviously looked forward to it. So she was deciding that this was one thing she needed.
Yeah. And that is why, for me, this comes back to like the thing that resonates is an idea that this was like kind of a bat mitzvah. You know, that she had this thing that she had been looking forward to, that she was going to be doing anyway, right? Like she wanted to have a chance to go and celebrate her coming of age before she lost her life. And the sacrifice is something that she's doing for her father, for her God, for her people. This is something that she's doing for herself. And she wants to make sure that she gets to do this one thing for herself before she goes. Sherry and then Diane.
Well, I guess, you know, one of the things that troubles me with all of this is there's a couple things. I mean, there's so many things, but one is, you know, the strong tribal ties, and just that the tribe just trumps everything, and that one of the things that's so basic about all life, including animals, is our will to survive, and it's almost you know, it's so depressing to me to think that that a woman's life was worth so little that she didn't even value her own life to survive, that she just, in a sense, has given up on her own life just for the tribe.
Yeah. I don't know if it's for the tribe as much as it's for her God. I think that, at least from a literary perspective, in terms of what we, the readers, are supposed to get out of this story, I think that you're right that practically it's for the tribe. And really, at the end of the day, for her father, and her father is doing it for the tribe. Her father is willing to sacrifice her life for the tribe. I don't know how much say she actually got in the matter. Yes, she acquiesced, but if she had said no, would she have had that choice? Unclear, and definitely unclear when read in the larger context of the Bible and women's power within that historical period in general. And I think that, you know, I'm going to feel sad if we leave here today without sort of being on team Bat Yiftach. Like, I really want us to be able to put ourselves in her shoes in a way where we can empathize with her, you know, and see her more as the victim of her father and her God and her society than anything else. And I think her asking for this 2 months of being able to have this time with her girlfriends is really her way of saying, I do value my life, and I have no choice about how my life is going to end or when my life is going to end, but I value the life that I was given, and I want to take this opportunity to go out and celebrate this life on my terms. I choose the time, I choose the duration, I choose the location, I choose the people that I want to do this with. Diane.
Thank you.
I was going to say, how many of us have that chance of being able to say what we do right before we die? And that's kind of what I was saying. She is having that chance to actually dictate what she gets to celebrate and what she gets to enjoy right before she actually dies. And that's a lot of times we don't have those last chances to say goodbye to our people that are special to us. This is a chance that she has all that set up for her, where she can at least dictate that.
Yeah. She may have had a very small bargaining power. She may have had very little choice in general. And yet she doesn't say, okay, fine, kill me now. You know, she says, okay, go ahead and fulfill your vow, but here are my terms. And I do think that is a kind of resistance and a kind of bravery. Steve and Pat are condemning Jephthah pretty harshly in the chat, and I think that is warranted. The rabbis also really, really don't like Jephthah. They do not think that he is right. They do not think that this was a wise choice. I don't think that they're as willing as we are to also condemn God and to say, where is God in this and why isn't God intervening? But they are certainly willing to condemn Jephthah. That is really where the rabbis go with the midrash on this story. Okay, I am now going to give a couple of modern feminist poetry, midrashic voices an opportunity to
Can I
come in.
just say one thing, because it keeps hitting me in the head? I keep thinking, why is this story in the Bible? what are we supposed to learn from it? Get out of it, move ourselves forward in some way, particularly because we're told not to be doing human sacrifice. So why is this story there? I mean, you kind of understand what the Akita, why it's there. Maybe it's just there for us to talk about every year at holidays. But this one, I don't find, like, if it was missing, would we be missing anything? I mean, it doesn't feel like it teaches us anything.
Right. I hear what you're saying. I think that, first of all, there's no one answer to that question, right? Like, why is anything in the Bible? There are two answers that come to my mind right off the top of my head. One of them we've talked about already, which is that this story is meant to teach us about obedience to God. That if one makes a vow to God, that vow should be honored, that if a daughter is honoring her father and mother, as we are taught to do, that she must accept the consequences of their actions. There's a lot of obedience and faith learning that we could do, although even as I say it, that sounds to me more like a Christian reading than a Jewish reading of this. I always like to look at the Bible from a literary historical perspective. And from a literary historical perspective, I want to remind us that this unfolds in the book of Judges. And we've talked before about, and we'll talk again about, the fact that the book of Judges was really the Wild West of the Bible, and that it, as a book, really exists historically in order to teach us that we needed kings, that we couldn't govern ourselves, and look at all the terrible things that happen when we govern ourselves. And so this really, through that lens, could be written off as another example of a look at what happens when we are governing ourselves. And won't things be better if we have a king? Won't things like this be avoided if we have a king? The answer, by the way, is no. Plenty of things like this happen once we have kings. But from the perspective of those who wrote the books of Kings and wrote the books that led up to them, that is the sort of consensus among scholars about why we have the book of Judges and all the terrible things that happen in the book of Judges altogether. Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to bring this around with another lens. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll take a look at some poetry to end this out. So first of all, we read last week two excerpts from the Judges Triptych by Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt. No, not last week, the week before, when we looked at Deborah and Yael. And this is the third part of the Judges Triptych. So there are these three women's stories that Rabbi Barenblatt lifts up in poetry. And the third is Yiftach's daughter. Israel whored with foreign gods until Yiftach, prostitute's son, rose up, wearing Holy Spirit like a cloak, saying, "Deliver the Ammonites into my hands, and whatever exits my house to meet me will be sacrificed to you in holy fire." And out came his only daughter, bare feet flying to greet him, Daddy, with her tambourine beneath her arm. He rent his garments in grief. She bent her head in submission to her father and his God's demands. 2 months with her friends in the hills, curve of soft hips beneath her hands, stretch of skin salted with hot tears. And she returned home, pale but resolute, and bared her neck. Her father steeled himself to raise his knife. The sun went down early, turning away from the war hero with bloodied hands. The mothers wept like the open skies when he burned her bones. No prophet spoke God's anger, and the maidens mourned alone. So I do think that this powerful poem, which in some ways just retells the story we already read, but what it chooses to lift up, what it chooses to highlight, really does give us a more gynocentric lens on this story. We have moments where we dip into what was happening out there on the hills, in the mountains with her girlfriends. We have a little bit more of her and her relationship to her father and her God, right? She bent her head in submission. So why did she say this was okay? It was submission. Submission to who and what? To her father and his God's demands. And when she comes home, she's resolute. She bares her neck so that he can lift his knife, which is a moment that we don't see in the biblical story that really does parallel this even more closely to the Akedah. Then we have this beautiful moment, something we did not get to talk about today. The mothers wept like the open skies, right? One of the questions I have when I read the story of Bat Yiftach is, where is her mother? Where is her mother in this story, right? It's a question I often ask when women are victims of different kinds of domestic abuse. And I do think that that is a lens to read this story through, is a lens of domestic abuse. Where are the mothers? Here, Rabbi Barenblatt gives them back to us, where they are weeping like the open skies. And finally, we have the maidens mourning her. What happens to her girlfriends who go off and spend those 2 months in the mountains with her and then lose their friends? They are going to be mourning her, right? And another lens that we can look at this story through when we ask about why would she choose to go off into the mountains and mourn with or celebrate, etc., with her girlfriends. I think in this historical moment that we ourselves find ourselves in, we can understand that and empathize with it very clearly, right? To be in solidarity with those who can understand us and our experience, who can be there for us in a moment of grief, in a moment where someone else has taken away our bodily autonomy from us, maybe even taken away our lives. What does it mean to be in community in a moment like that? And what does it mean to be in a community of those who are also suffering from the same patriarchy, from the same misogyny, from the same helplessness and oppression? So I think this moment where the poem ends on the maidens mourning her alone, right, really highlights that for us. So we're already over time. There's another poem in here by Enid Dame. Enid Dame is an incredible poet that I highly recommend that you take some time, if you have the chance, to read this. And then finally, if anyone is interested, there is also some more midrash from Jonathan Kirsch. But for anyone who's interested, Bela Lovins wrote a modern ritual. The question that she asked when she read the story is, what were they actually doing? What did their ritual look like when they were out there on the mountain? And the Bible itself tells us that the death of Jephthah's daughter became commemorated by the women of Israel for some period of time, right? It's a tradition that's lost to us. We don't do it today, but for some period of time, maybe even hundreds or thousands of years, women went out into the mountains every year to remember Jephthah's daughter by performing the ritual that her and her girlfriends performed. And so Bela Lovins, that ritual is lost to us. Bela Lovins writes anew that ritual for us. And so anyone who is interested in going out into the mountains from now on to remember Jephthah's daughter, Bela Lovins offers a ritual for us to do so, and sort of picks up a lost thread of Jewish women's history for us. Okay, any final thoughts or questions or concerns, shouting from the mountaintops, that anyone would like to do for Jephthah's daughter before we say Shavua Tov today?
Is there an easy or simple answer to the question of the significance of 2 months?
No, absolutely not. And in general, time in the Bible is always something that we need to be suspect of, right? I think that your point that, like, why isn't this 40 days is actually a really good question, because it could have just as easily been 40 days, meaning she went out there for a long time. One possibility is that, like, 2 months at that time of year is going to represent the time of springtime, especially in Israel, where springtime is short. So it could have been that the maiden goes to mourn her springtime of her life with a springtime ritual for the period of springtime, right? But that's just my hypothesis, reading this through the lens of Jonathan Kirsch. It's not anything knowable.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you all. Thank you all. And may we all be bringing Jephthah's daughter and her memory into our own work that we are doing, you know, in the days, weeks, and months that we are coming up against.
Yeah. It's very hard not to feel very discouraged. Yesterday, I brought this up in Torah study, you know, Eve was saying, you know, it pointed an article in the New York Times about, you know, trying to understand the other side. And, you know, I really don't know if I want to put my energy there, you know, to
Yeah.
try to find what they're thinking about. I'm just, you know, and this is not the end of it. I mean, you know, Clarence Thomas has made it very clear that he is going after contraceptives. He's going after the LGBT community. That we are just entering just a darker and darker spiral downward. And I feel helpless to do anything about it. I don't know what to do. And you know, and I just got, you know, getting, you know, messages and emails from different people. And I have different people in my life who are handling it in their own way, mostly by just trying to focus on what they can control, realizing that this is something that's so out of our control. That said, I mean, I think there's supposed to be a demonstration here on Tuesday. I'm not sure if it's Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday. I mean, you know, to participate. It's just all very frightening to me.
Yeah, I really appreciate, I want to lift up the feelings that you named, that people are feeling helpless, that people are feeling frustrated, that this is a really disheartening moment, and that not only do we feel out of control, but we are out of control, right? And I just want to lift those things up and say, yes, and many other people are feeling the same things that you are feeling. I have no good answers, because the answer for what the fight is going to look like and how the arc gets bent is one that only history will be able to tell, right? There certainly are lots of actions that are being put out there for people who feel that in this moment, what you need to do is take action. I personally am not yet feeling in a moment of action. I am feeling in a moment that I need to grieve and to feel my anger and to feel my sadness and to feel my helplessness. I personally need to feel what I'm feeling right now. That is where I am at. And I absolutely echo your sentiments. I feel helpless and I feel very frightened. And I think that the first step is to feel and to heal, and healing only happens when we actually honor what we're feeling. And then from there, when, like, and I said this yesterday, when our tank is full, then we can start, I think, to think more about action. There are some people who need to take action right now, and I respect that as well. And there are many leaders that we can follow for those who need to feel that they can take control of this moment by taking action. That's not personally where I'm at yet. And so for those who are really just in a moment of shock and frustration and anger and feeling feelings, that is a perfectly, maybe the right place to be as a human being right now. Yeah. I wish I had something more uplifting, but we're not there yet. I promise to get us to something uplifting in the longer haul of the moral arc, but not today.
Sherry, I would suggest you read a lot of the things that are being put out by Trua, the Jewish response to justice, and the RAC. They're both putting out some, I think, really consoling things, and then talking about what things we can do. And they're not necessarily talking about marching in the streets. They're talking about doing things, and especially the following on the action of the synagogue in Florida that is actually suing Florida over the anti-abortion law in Florida as being specifically a violation of Jewish religious rights. So
yeah, and the National Council of Jewish Women is also a great follow for this moment. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg Rabbi Jill Jacobs is a Trua. She's an absolute leader. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg has been working on this issue for at least the last year, knowing that this was coming down the pipeline. Yeah, so there are absolutely a lot of really inspirational leaders right now in the Jewish community who are leading through action. And even they are also telling us to feel what we're feeling.
Judith, you said Trua, and what other organization did you mention?
Could you put it in the,
Rack.
could you
Rack
put them
is
in the
the-
chat?
Yeah,
I
so
I also-
Trua, the
Um,
RAC is the Religious Action
Action Committee.
Center
Yeah.
Or you?
and the National Council of Jewish Women.
I also have a lot of suggestions for things to do. There are going to be a lot of people coming here for abortions, and we're signed up to drive people, when they get here and drive them to their appointments and things like that. So there's a lot of those kinds of things. And then political action people that if we don't do that, we're just handing this whole thing away. So I cannot stress enough.
There is work to be done. There is a
Yep.
lot of work to be done. Yep,
Well,
that arc is
this-
not going to bend on its own.
Thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. Wishing you a week of peace.
Thank you.
Personal peace, communal peace, and peace across the nation. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Sure, tough.